So yeah, and Ilya Reznik, am the Instructed Machines janitor and the CEO at the same time, and I actually don't drink coffee.
Welcome back to the one and only MLOps community podcast. Folks, today I feel honored because we get to talk with Ilya, and there's not many times that you can chat with a staff level machine learning engineer from a company like Facebook or Meta, as it's called these days. Today is that day. Ilya recently resigned, I guess you could say, or quit, the way that he likes to say it. He was more blunt about it. And he did some consulting afterwards, and now he's spending his time helping others recognize the best way to become a staff machine learning engineer. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about his recent trip to NeurIPS and everything in between. We were talking about why fine tuning is not all it's cracked up to be. And you said that the TLDR is don't do it.
Yeah, fine tuning is a great technique, and there's a lot you can get out of it, especially like in the LLM world. If you're trying to get a particular shape of an output, it may be worth it, right? Like if what you're really after is JSON, like it may be worth fine tuning the model to that. Though modern models like understand JSON a little bit better. Um, but uh, but the problem is like every time you do it, it's a lot of effort, and the first model to come off the press is usually worse than the original one. And the whole idea of fine tuning is you're taking this huge LLM or whatever other model that can perform really well on many different tasks. And you're trying to get it to perform better on your task at the expense of performing worse on all the other tasks.
Uh-huh.
And that works sometimes. But if you can prompt engineer your way out of it, like you should do that first.
Yeah. The other piece on it, which is hilarious to me, is that you fine tune it and it's a bit of a crapshoot because you don't know if what comes out the other side is going to be better or worse until it comes out. So you spend all this money and time and energy on fine tuning just to recognize that it's actually not that good.
Yeah. Yeah, you gotta be very careful with the data you fine tune on as well. Especially like you can fine tune a large model on a few thousand examples.
Uh,
But you gotta be pretty careful about what those a few thousand examples are. People usually put what they have rather than like think through like, okay, like how imbalanced are my data? Like what's happening here? So yeah, fine tuning is a great technique. I liken it to training and embedding in the first place. You know how that's really more magic than anything else because I've trained so many embeddings where you just pulling your hair out, you can see it's all gone now. And I used to look like you before I started training embedding models. Uh, and uh, and then like at the end, you're like, oh, my objective function is wrong. I shouldn't be training for this. I should be training for something else. And you switch that, and everything just works magically the first time.
right.
The first time after months and months of work.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, and you learn that the hard way. It's not like you can read a blog post and be like, "Oh, this is exactly what's wrong with mine." You have to just kind of trial and error it.
yeah. Well, and in fact, there is no blog post, right? Like, in fact, all of these problems are one-offs, and just because it worked this time doesn't mean it's going to work on the next one. And so there are best practices, so you start there, but at the end, there's some voodoo. You got to make sure nobody's poking your doll
Yeah.
with a needle.
But, I mean, I've heard a lot of this fine-tune for form,
Hmm.
and one thing that I can't really get my creativity around is what are the other reasons you would fine-tune for form if it's not JSON output?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's other structured output, right? Like HTML or Markdown or whatever. But also like sometimes it's not just form. Sometimes it's if you're in an area where the language is really particular, so like expert language is very different. I worked with a medical company and we had to do that. Um, like that's another place, right? Because the distribution of tokens is really different when basically every word that you say is Latin with an occasional English in the middle.
Mm.
And so,
Yeah.
so those kinds of scenarios where like your output is quite different. Um, People try to do that for like knowledge. So if there's a very particular set of facts, but the problem is LLMs don't have knowledge. They don't store facts. They store probabilities.
Yeah.
And so like in that case, I don't think it's useful at all to fine tune. I haven't found it useful yet.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
should
And
say.
that's the where rags will get you a lot further.
Yeah,
And
and even RAG is no panacea. Like, what RAG does is it puts the fact a lot closer in context,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean that it depends on how strong the prior was for the LLM, right? And like if the prior was really strong, it still won't pick it up. So what people call hallucinations are not hallucinations. They're totally like they're an artifact of the way the model works.
Mhm.
And so the term hallucination assumes that like, oh, you're just like out in left field. You're not. Like this is a reasonable prediction based on the distribution of training data. And so I think LLMs are extremely useful. I think they will be with us for a long time. I do not think that they're going to be the only technique going forward. And
What do you mean by that?
I think there will be so like on the non ML side, right? Like you have databases, but
Yeah.
nobody is like, oh, like um I don't know, MongoDB solves this problem 100%. No, like Mongo is like part of the solution that's there that we rely on, and it's useful. Well, it depends on who you ask. Some of my friends are like, "Don't ever use Mongo," uh, but uh, but you need to build a solution around it. And LLM is similar. Like you need to build some knowledge retrieval around it. Is it RAG? I don't know. Maybe it's Graph.
Mm.
You and there's a lot of talk. I know you want to talk about this, so I don't know if I should be moving there yet. But like, I was just at NeurIPS last week, right?
Yep.
And there's a lot of talk about how we ran out of data.
Mhm.
And what we ought to do is reinforcement learning. And people are like, wait a minute, RLHF. And all the reinforcement experts are like, ha ha ha, that's not reinforcement learning, not at all. Reinforcement learning is one of those cool things that's always like the next big thing, but never has been the big thing.
Yeah, like
Um,
agents.
so I think there will be some reinforcement learning in that system as well. There will be some RAG in that system as well. There will be some other techniques around the LLM that make it actually useful.
It's interesting to think about, like, you're talking about, okay, databases are there, but then you have different flavors of databases, whether it's your Mongos or your Cockroach or Oracle or whatever. And you, as the architect of the system, get to decide what your trade-offs are and what you're really trying to optimize for. And so you're going to have maybe it's an LLM is the center of that, or maybe it's not. And maybe it's a graph rag, maybe it is a fine-tuned LLM or a lot of fine-tuned small language models or something like that, that we will see. And it's cool to think about that as you get the flexibility to choose. One thing that I do feel like, though, is that you have some standard patterns that are coming up. And if you look at it like trails in the woods or trails to the top of the mountain, you definitely see there are standard design patterns that folks are kind of taking. And one of them is not the fine-tuning route. And so I think that that's pretty clear as to, all right, if we're going to fine-tune, we better have a really good reason and we better really need to do it because everything else up until this point has failed us. So it's like fine-tuning is our last option.
Yeah, fine tuning is expensive, and it gives even when you're super successful, it gives you a limited benefit. And so like sometimes that's what you need. I absolutely agree with you. It's all trade-offs, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes that last like 2-3% is exactly what you needed. But it's not, you know, if the model is really bad at math, fine-tuning is not magically going to make it better. But if the model is like, oh, you keep giving me really informal things when I ask you for a formal letter, or what I really care about is LaTeX, output, and what you keep giving me is markdown. Like, yeah, that's a great place for it, and you could probably get that kind of improvement from fine tuning. But it's not end all to be all. About the best practices, I do want to caution that uh, you're on shifting sand a little bit. We're all on shifting sand
Yeah.
a little bit. So, like, best practices that emerge today in 2 years, we might be like, "Can you believe we used to do that?"
That's such a great point. I mean, even just with RAG, how now people are like, yeah, what we did a year ago is called naive RAG because we were naive back then. Now there's this advanced RAG, or you got to do agentic RAG. And even what is it, the React agent architecture, that's now not even seen as really useful because there's much better ways to do it.
Yep.
So it's true that this is going to be shifting very quickly. It's almost like month by month, you're seeing new and better ways to do things. And maybe they seem new. You get a lot of energy and attention around them, and it feels like, wow, this is much better. And then after the community has played with it a bit, they recognize that it's not actually that valuable. So you are yeah, shifting sand is a great way of putting that because you are not super clear on what is signal and what is noise.
Yeah. Yeah, and, you know, it's evolving. There's a lot of money going into this, obviously. There's a lot of, benefit to getting this right. It's not a kind of thing where you can learn everything now and then spend the next 20-year career on what you've learned. It's a
Yeah,
kind of thing where you learn stuff now and then you learn stuff for the next 20 years. Uh,
yeah, totally. Well, speaking of which, I mean, that's what the conference like you were at last week, NeurIPS, is why it's so cool, right? Because it brings all of the newest stuff out into the open. What were some of your favorite takeaways besides not being able to order an Uber, like you mentioned before we hit record?
I actually use buses most of all, more than Ubers there, because Vancouver is a very good public transportation city. I don't know if people from there would say that, but where I stayed, it was definitely really useful. But yeah, I mean, it's NeurIPS is terrific. NeurIPS is the flagship conference in ML, has been for decades. The first NeurIPS came out the year that I was born, so it's been around for a long time. And it started out as a very academic conference between neurobiologists and machine learning people when they were like, "Hey, we can learn stuff from each other." And the main takeaway from this really is that I didn't see that many truly academic papers and posters and presentations. Like they're majority applied right now, and there's a huge push into like, okay, like we have transformer models, how do we use them? Like how do we actually make them useful, which is not usually the focus of NeurIPS. The focus of NeurIPS is usually let's look for a new architecture, let's go off.
Yeah,
And so there's definitely convergence on transformers, and you see this from different industry. Like when I was coming up in this, it was like if you did computer vision, you didn't do language. Like I was the weird one out where I was like, no, I can do either. But now it's like everybody's working on the same model. So one invited speaker put it really well. They were like, we used to have a lot of models, and then we kind of converged toward the transformer architecture, but now we got to diverge back into the applications. And how does this apply to everything? So that's probably my main takeaway is that there's a lot of thinking that's happening about the system that we talked about. Like, what does that have to have? And how does that work? Like, and we're way more advanced than we used to be a few years back. We're talking about like left to right LLMs versus right to left LLMs. And like they do really well in different kinds of things, right? Like the left to right in English.
yeah,
There are, uh, there are languages that are read the other way. So yes, but in English, the left to right does really well at language. The right to left actually does math a lot better.
true.
We're talking about not every token is as important as others. So some tokens are fuzzy, and maybe you should be treating them as such. Um, we're talking about reinforcement learning. There's a lot of excitement about using reinforcement learning as we're running out of data, or it feels like we're running out of data. I'm not even sure I buy that argument that we're running out of data. There's, Ilya Reznik talked about that, and I'm like, his argument was that we only have one internet, I was like, "Dude, we're uploading a new internet, like, every 2 weeks. Like, this podcast did not exist, right? And
Exactly.
so, like, now it does." There are rumblings on the side and the hallway track. This didn't make it into the main conference, but there are some rumblings about curriculum learning, which is a thing we kinda gave up on entirely, and
What is that?
yeah, so first of all, the way that we learn today, it's like if when you were little, your mother came to you and said, "Here's 80% of everything I know, shuffled randomly. Now I'm gonna test you on the other 20%," right? Like that's just not what happens. With kids, what we do is we tell them, "Here's a sound, here's a word, here's a sentence." And they progress through that in a supervised manner. Like a teacher tells you, this is the first thing you need to learn, this is the second thing.
Yeah.
And so but that's not what we do with models. What we do with models is like shovel all the soup and like you go figure it out. And so curriculum learning is about how do we create that step by step where like a model can learn something basic first and then start building on top of that. And it involves a lot of data curation. It's very like expensive, but it might be worth it. It might get us better outcomes. And so, like, we're starting to talk about that again. That hasn't been a conversation for the last like 20 years, honestly. But it's coming up again.
And just because it's more structured, it will be more efficient? Is that the idea?
Well, the idea is that it respects the concepts in the real world. It
Mm.
respects that, like, you know, addition and subtraction are prerequisite to multiplication. And so the idea is that you can be quite a bit more data efficient and you can also like start really understanding concepts and symbols that uh, represent the real world. And then you can start avoiding things like hallucinations because you're not reliant entirely on statistics. Those statistics came step by step, and you know that the early steps are fundamental. Um, it's problematic though because it's a lot harder. But also, NeurIPS was always about being inspired by biology, and this is very much inspired by biology. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. I don't know if it'll ever gain traction. Lots of things we talk about in NeurIPS never really leave.
Yeah.
But that was one that struck me. The other thing for me with my background, so when I was at Twitter, I owned model evaluation,
Uh-huh.
offline model evaluation for all of Twitter. And the interesting thing is there's been a lot of talks on evals and how bad they are. And
Even at NeurIPS, there were still talks?
even at NeurIPS,
I feel like the only talks I saw this year were rag talks and eval talks, and it was kind of if you boil them down, it was like rag is difficult, and you got to watch out for where it fails, and here's all the ways that it fails, and maybe here's some tricks you can do. And then eval talks were like, evals suck.
yeah,
We don't have any good like these leaderboards are steering you astray. It's all
yeah.
marketing, and don't listen to anybody who says that they have a soda model.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a talk that I went away with, like, mind blown, and it was about something
Yeah,
else, but this is the line that, like, blew my mind. And the speaker was like, "Yeah, like, we have this benchmark, and we got 95% on it, or 90 something, I don't know, some high
yeah,
number, and the model can't do anything real in the real world." And I'm like, "How like, what is the disconnect that you can get 95% on your benchmark and still not be able to perform any useful work?"
yeah,
Like, clearly, your benchmark is not what you think it is.
yeah. It's not valuable.
And then, like, you add so this is, like evals are a mess, early on, and we talked about, like, LLM as a judge a few years ago, like, I was fortunate enough to work with awesome people at Arise, on, like, explaining this and putting that concept together, but that's not even the panacea, and then you go into the agentic world, and then you go into, like, multi-agent world,
Uh-huh.
and I don't even like, how do you evaluate a multi-agent system? Like,
Oh,
the
man.
amount of complexity, and like, some of this is understandable, right? I think Ilya in his talk, talked about how as the intelligence grows, it's understandable that you will have a harder and harder time evaluating it, uh, which is cool, but my job is to make sure I can evaluate it. And so I don't know how to do that, honestly. there are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of concepts, but I don't know that we've converged yet. There was a talk by D. Scully, the CEO of Kaggle.
Love that guy.
I love
And for anybody that doesn't know, he also wrote the most incredible paper when it comes to MLOps in, like, 2016, which is the high
high interest
interest
credit
credit
card.
card debt of machine learning, which everyone's probably seen it if you've ever seen a talk on MLOps because it has that diagram of all these boxes of things you need to do to put machine learning into production, and the model box is just a small box out of all the other stuff that you gotta think about when you're productionizing machine learning. But anyway, I digress. Keep going.
No, that's terrific. Yeah, yeah. D is amazing, and I think the world of him. But he his talk basically made me paranoid, right? Like I was already a paranoid, but he's like at Kaggle, their main problem is that people find signals that aren't actual signals. They're like they leaked into the data somehow. Somebody put all the positive examples in one folder and all the negative examples in another folder, and your model is not predicting anything real, it's just predicting what folder it was in, right? Which is easy because you have the path. And his point was that researchers should look at it that same way too, not that like you're intentionally going to hack your metrics, but like you're unintentionally going to hack yourself.
Mhm.
And so he talked about like, okay, so like what can we even do? The problem is when your data is internet scale, everything is already in there, right? Like everything that ever hit the internet is leaked. So you can't hold out that data anymore. Um, and so he talked about new benchmarks that are based around uh, some sort of a separation, either a physical separation because it's not on the internet yet. So you talked about for like some math benchmark, having mathematicians, like top mathematicians in the world, go into the woods, sit in the room by themselves, come up with problems that haven't been ever with us, and then come back and evaluate models on those.
Mm.
And then he talked about like time separation, right, is another one. So if you're trying to predict, I don't know, the stock market or something, you can't fully evaluate your model until 6 months later. And unfortunately, that's not how it works in our stock market predictions. All of those models are like they're going to be irrelevant tomorrow, so we need to
Yeah.
retrain. Uh,
Yeah.
but but his point is that we need to be a little bit more patient and spend a little bit more time generating data for benchmarks, because even like we do our best, but all the benchmarks for LLMs, like all the data for them is leaked. Like
Yeah.
all the data for them is on the internet. And so this is how you get to a scenario where you're 95% accurate on your benchmark
And worthless.
and worthless.
Yeah. That's why I appreciate these, leaderboards or these benchmarks that are like pro LLM. That's from the Process team, they put it together, and all of the actual data that is created for these benchmarks is all closed source. So theoretically, the models haven't seen them. I can imagine that is only good for the first couple go arounds, and then the models have seen them. So the process team, I think, is constantly updating that data, and it's constantly like creating new ones. And so they have different types. They've got, I know they have one which is from Stack Overflow, and that is public data. So I can imagine that most of the models have been trained on that in some way, shape, or form, which is funny because a lot of these models still do really bad on it. But uh, take that what you will, or take what you will with that. I don't really know how to understand it.
Well, and just to be clear, I know lots of folks who train large language models that we use every day, and I think all of them are like really decent, and they try really hard to avoid data that they know they're going to be tested on. But
Uh,
it's like it's not an easy thing to miss,
yeah,
because you can't look at every data point that goes into this. And when you're just like, just give me the internet, like,
yeah,
how do you want to train this? I don't know, just
so
the
big.
internet. Then there's a lot of stuff that leaks in, and so like I don't think it's an intentional, hackery. I think it just happens by virtue of the way that we train these.
You're gonna love this. I saw some kind of a nonprofit that was Their whole thing was, "Let's make the internet mediocre again so that this AI is not better than us at doing things, and we don't get, like, unreasonable expectations put on us because AI can help us do it." And so what they've been doing is going around and buying up domains in the common crawl, and instead of doing, like, nefarious things, like I've heard of other people trying to do,
Mhm.
where they will put different poisonous data on these common crawl, websites, they're just putting a bunch of really mediocre content that isn't good at all on all of this common crawl, so it's flooding or what they're trying to do is flood the LLM training data, but at the end of the day, you have to have so many of these and put so much content out there to even make, like, a little drop in the ocean, right?
I think the internet does a pretty good job of making itself mediocre without extra help.
Without those guys. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, so the funny thing there is then I know you've spent a lot of time training models and thinking about that. How do you go about, like, that data issue and the data quality issue?
I mean, yeah, it's hard. And I'm not sure that I have a silver bullet, right? Like oftentimes a lot of the things that I've trained are pre-LLM. Like I still I worked in this industry 10 years before LLMs ever hit. So most of my experience is still pre-LLM. And even like since LLMs came out, I was training Meta's ad prediction model, and
Uh,
that's not trained on the same data. You can be a lot more careful there. But you kind of I don't know. I don't know that there are great ways to do this other than you do it and then you look at your evaluations and you trust them, which we just talked about how you can't.
yeah.
And they guide you into the segments where you're maybe underperforming, and then you look at what's happening with those segments, and then you train again, right? Like the the beauty and the downside kind of working in ML is that you can always try again, and you should always go in with an idea of like, I'm probably not going to think through every single contingency. I'm probably not going to think through every single data issue. Uh, when you gain enough experience, you've been burnt by enough things to where you start checking them. Uh, but like even for me, like 10 years in, like I don't think that checklist is all that inclusive of everything that could happen. And so it's an iterative process, and it's a process that you learn from and you do a little bit better next time. Hopefully the person next to you has been burnt on a couple of different things. It really does help to work with different people.
Sure.
And you gain a lot of knowledge that you don't pay for
Yeah.
with bringing down production, which I have done. I've
Sure.
done that. Uh, but
Through battle scars.
the battle scars, and like that's good knowledge. It's even better knowledge when somebody next to you is like, "Hey, I've brought down production this way before. Let's not do it again." Uh, and so there's a lot of iteration. Back when I started in the industry, we used to do a lot of feature engineering, but the data sets were a lot smaller. And so, like, on a small data set, you can start understanding it really well. But, like, how do you even go about understanding language data, right? Like, you're going to have an embedding and you're going to visualize it. But guess what? Like, how are you going to train that model? You're going to train an embedding. And, and so, like, when your tool for understanding the data and the tool that you're training are one and the same, essentially, like you just try it. You just try it and see what comes out of it. And I know that's pretty wasteful of the compute. I know that there are environmental consequences. I don't tend to think of them when I train. I probably should, but you're trying to be compute efficient just because it's expensive, not because it's environmentally friendly. But even so, you kind of go into it with an expectation that you're not going to be right the first time you train it. You're going
Mm.
to need to do some work on it, and ideally, you know all of this, but you start with a small model. You start with overfitting on like a small data set to see like even like directionally how you write. You do early stopping to make sure that like you're not training longer than you absolutely have to.
Mm.
But even with all those hacks, like the way that we do machine learning today is just a lot of data and a lot of compute. And uh, you do some thinking, but the thinking is fairly limited compared to amount of data and compute.
Well, we should talk about a lot of the stuff you're doing around ML careers and for people that are in the AI world, I think that you're doing a huge service to people because of the experience that you've had. I know that when we first talked, probably back in 2020,
Mhm.
you were still at Twitter. Since then, you've gone on to work at Meta and then the health tech company. But the interesting thing when you were at Twitter, I think you just got the job and you were like, yeah, I'm thinking about trying to take that next step into becoming a staff machine learning engineer. And for me, I thought that was fascinating just because it was like, oh, okay. And so what do you need to do there? And you're like, well, I think I need to give more talks and be out in the community more. Turns out that wasn't true. That or was it directionally correct? Because first of all, you didn't give any talks. I kept bugging you to give a talk in the community, and then you were like, "Yeah, yeah, later, later, later," and you ended up getting staff engineer anyway. So what happened?
Well, now I can give talks as a staff engineer. No, I think slightly different companies do it differently, right? And so, Twitter was particularly quite, um they put a lot of emphasis on, like, open sourcing stuff and publishing within Twitter. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, it might be my fault, Twitter died while I was there. And I think it has something to
Wait,
do with change in
uh,
ownership, but,
no, but you
uh
were there when Elon took over? No.
so
Were
I
you?
left a little bit before. I was there for the
Yeah.
entire drama, and I left,
Oh my
like,
god.
a month before because it was pretty clear where it was going. So yeah, Twitter was a terrific place to work, honestly, and I don't think it is today.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
but it was different companies prize different things, right? And so there's more than one way to staff, and at staff, you really start, seeing the archetypes, and different people get staff for different reasons. Some people get to staff because they're really broad. Like, you always kind of have to be T-shaped rather than broad. You have to be broad, but like really deep in something.
Mhm.
But some people like me get to staff because we can understand a lot of different things across the ML model lifecycle. And other people get there because they're an ultra specialist on text embeddings after it rains in
Yeah,
some
the
sort of
Venn diagram, it's like there's a lot of different pieces that they're just in the center of, and
yeah,
you're like, "Wow."
yeah. And staff engineers are leaders. And so like a lot of what you need to demonstrate is that you can uh produce at a high level over time. And so people get frustrated. They're like, "Oh, I've done this for a year. Like, when am I going to get staff?" And I'm like, your time horizon on staff is like 3 years for anything you plan. And so just because you could perform at that level for a year, like, I'm not quite convinced yet sometimes.
Wow,
Uh,
okay.
so, so some of it was just timing, right? For me, that I still needed to wait. And honestly, like, I didn't get staff at Twitter. I got staff when I went over to Meta. And part of it was my interview performance, and part of it was all the experiences that I've had before.
Okay.
Um, but I know that, like, Google, for example, does prize talks and being visible in the community in some way for their staff, and especially senior staff. Everybody I know who's senior staff at Google has done at least some conferences,
Yeah.
said at least something that's worthwhile. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's the problem with this is that there's more than one path, and in ML in particular, I think there are a lot of folks who do a really good job, like in MLOps community, talking about MLOps. There's a ton of good material for software engineers on how to like advance through your career, but there's not a ton of material for MLEs. And
Yeah.
what material there is usually comes from really well-meaning folks, but like folks who haven't seen the higher ends of the ladder, uh,
Right.
and uh, and it changes by the time you're here. But one of the things I'm working on is next year. I want to invite a lot of folks who are more senior than me and have a podcast with them about specifically about their career. How did they get to where they are? And kind of ask them really targeted questions. Like, I'm trying to get a former director for Meta that I worked with to come and talk about, like, what's it like to be a director? Like,
Yeah.
what are the challenges that happen there that you
Yeah.
don't see until you get to that level, right? And yeah, and so like a lot of folks who are a lot smarter about it than me, um, and to try to understand that area a lot better. In the meantime, I do have a small YouTube channel, which right now is about helping you get the next ML job.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I really wanted it to be broader, and so I did like a video on mentorship, and it tanked. Like nobody watched it. Like to this day, it has like 200 watches, and like my other videos have like 14,000, right? And what I understood was that nobody is talking about ML career path
Mhm.
at this level, and so people don't think about it until they have to look for a job,
Yeah.
and then they have to look for a job, and they're like, "Where do I go?"
Yeah.
And so and so I started the channel with a little bit more content, with content a little bit more heavily leaned toward like how do you interview, how do you get this next job, and it's kind of in my mind understood that at some point it'll be a bait and switch, where I'm going to say, okay, now that you got the job, here's how you actually do it, and here's how you get promoted, and here's how you make sure you don't ruin the world while you're doing this. So that's kind of the direction of it. But hopefully it'll be gradual enough to where people uh, won't unsubscribe.
Yeah, no, they'll go with you on the journey because
Yeah,
they probably are in the job and going, "Uh-oh,
yeah,
now I gotta find a new YouTuber to
yeah.
watch videos of who will tell me how to do this. I might as well just
Yeah,
listen to you."
just keep watching me. You don't need a
Yeah.
new YouTuber. But there are things about our profession that are different. For example, like the shifting sands that we talked about, right? Like
Yeah.
this is so my master's thesis was about computer vision, and it was in 20 so like I started it in 2011. Um I finished it in 2013, and it was like Har Cascades, right? Because nobody has heard of a CNN by then, and by the time, like, I got it out in 2013, it was like, "Dude, like, you should have done it with CNNs." And I was like, "I know. I'm not gonna do another 2 years, though, like, I'm
Yep.
done." But I know I should have done it with CNNs. And so it's the only field I know of where, like, your graduate thesis can be irrelevant by the time you're done writing it. And like the new kid graduating tomorrow probably knows more about transformer models than I do, having 10 years of experience in the field, because I have to maintain the models that are there today.
Yeah.
And they had like all the time in the world to go learn about the latest and
Starting
greatest.
from scratch.
And
Yeah.
so how do you even have a career in that, right? Like how do you stay multiple decades doing that kind of thing where Transformers weren't a thing before 2017. Like nobody really understood that this was useful. Like a couple of people did, but they were crazy. Uh, and and it wasn't until you could bring a lot of scale to this that you even see this, because I saw early papers on attention mechanism. And I was like, yeah, like it's
Cool.
interesting. Like we have LSTMs. Like I'm
Yeah.
not sure how this is better than an LSTM. I literally said that. So please don't take, future advice from me. But I also sold 500 Bitcoins at $1 each. Uh,
No.
yeah.
Oh,
So
man. Well, I'm glad it still worked out for you.
yeah.
You've had a pretty successful career. You didn't need those. It
Oh,
makes
I
some
did.
people
I did.
stupid taxes, they call it, you know? We all
Yeah.
gotta do that kinda stuff.
Yeah.
And you're just continuing to, kill it. So I love seeing that, and I love like, what you're talking about is very few people in the world actually talk about, and I think you mentioned it to me last time we chatted probably where you were saying the folks that are in these positions, they're so busy doing their jobs, they usually can't talk about what it means to be in these positions and how you get to these positions. Like you said, everybody's journey is different into them. And then the other thing is 9 times out of 10, when you're staff MLE, you're at a large company and you've probably got some or a lot of NDAs that you've
Mhm.
signed. So it's not like you can just go out there and preach from the rooftops.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if it's intentional gatekeeping, but there is a little bit of gatekeeping happening as well, which is weird to me, right? Because like anybody who came up in this industry, when I came up in this industry, part of the fun was that everybody makes everything open source, and you can go in and you can like, "Oh, PyTorch, like, I can understand that." And Meta still operates similarly, like, that's why Llama is there, and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, like, we still can get benefit, we still can get ours, but, like, let's make sure that people can use these kinds of techniques and, like, models and whatever, but a lot of other companies have started being a lot more closed off,
Yeah, that's a
and,
bummer.
notably open AI. Um,
I like the emphasis on the open part
yeah,
there.
it's, I think both parts of their name are a lie, in fact,
Yeah.
but, you know, closed ML is what they
Yeah,
should be
yeah,
called.
that should be their real name. The other piece that I think, um, I wanted to talk about is how what should you know as a staff engineer, like a staff MLE? What are things that you deal with, and how is that different than you mentioned how big of a gap it is from what is it, like L5 to L6
Mhm,
is a really hard gap to jump. And first of all, it's probably worth just clarifying staff titles are 9 times out of 10 at large companies, right? And like tech forward companies. I don't see a lot of staff titles at either companies with 200 people or like enterprises. I don't really see like
mhm.
a bank. I don't think I see many staff titles there. So maybe you can demystify that part for me too.
I think in a bank, if you make that much money, you have to be a VP.
Yeah.
I think there are, like, legal reasons why you have to be a VP, so,
Oh, interesting.
so that's why they have banks have very weird titles.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, there's title inflation going on too everywhere. So like sometimes you look at a small company and you're like, oh, that's a principal engineer. And they would like convert to like a FANG type company and they'll be like senior, maybe mid-level. And one of my peers at Meta was a VP, like an actual VP with like an org at a bank before. And I'm like, we're at the same level? Like this seems wrong. But that's how it works. So like when I talk about staff, I talk about specifically like tech companies, right? Like and specifically bigger tech companies. Not necessarily just saying like Uber, Microsoft, like
Yeah.
all of those companies as well.
But yeah, tech first companies.
Yeah, tech first companies. I think that's a good way to put it. And I think again, it depends a lot on the archetype. My archetype is a technical lead. So for me, what it was is don't do what I did. For me, what it was is by day you're a technical lead. You're basically helping everybody on your team to succeed. And at one point, I had almost 30 people that I was a tech lead for. And at those levels, that's closer to like a senior staff level. But at Meta, you're never at the level that you're at. You're usually performing at the next level.
So that you
So
can get that,
everybody is one up
um
from what they tell you. But by day you're doing that, and you're making sure that there's right scope on the team, that the projects are going in the right direction. And it's weird because you usually have more information. I've dealt with a lot of like really sensitive information, like the way that we're approaching a lot of new regulations on privacy in ads. Like I had more context on that than a lot of people on my team. And so like I had to guide them without like doing things that would be illegal, you know, that like telling them what they're actually working towards sometimes. Um, and and so um, and so that's a full-time job. But in addition to that, at Meta, you're expected to contribute still. And so I had projects that were quite a bit more challenging, um, but maybe a little bit less time sensitive. That's the thing that I learned at Adobe because at Adobe, I was working on a really big project and I was a technical lead on it, coordinated like 80 people around it. And I, being young and naive, I was like, I'm going to take the biggest part of this and I'm going to implement that. And I became a bottleneck so quickly
Oh, yeah.
because I needed to manage all the pieces and I needed to write the biggest piece. And so like staff engineers, once you get burned by this a couple of times, you start taking on pieces that are a little bit on the side. Or if somebody gets really stuck, You're there to unstuck them. Oftentimes, like 0 to 1 projects, you're like, "I'm not sure how this is gonna work, so, like, let me take the first stab at it, and then when I'm pretty sure that we're on the right direction, I'll hand it off." There are lots of handoffs, like, I at Meta, you onboard onto a new project every couple of months, because, you need to move it forward. Usually, like, you come in as a me because something is wrong or, like, nobody knows what they're doing here yet, and so you go in and you move it, and once it starts moving, the idea is that your time is better spent on another project that's not moving right now, so you can hand it off to an E5 and say, "I can tell you exactly what needs to happen here in the next couple of months, so you can go get started, but I need to go off to a new project." So there's some amount of stress here, and my advice for folks, honestly, oftentimes people look at the levels and it's like numerical, so it's easy to measure your progress. It's like, "Oh, I'm a 6, I want to be a 7," right? But I'm like, "Do you? Do you really?" Because at bigger tech companies that have gotten their compensation straight, which not everybody does, but the companies that have, like, understood what the compensation is, you can make more money as a good E5 than a crappy E6. Because
Wait, how's that work?
you're gonna get better refreshers, you're gonna get more bonus, and so, like, in the long term, a good E5 at Meta is gonna make more than a crappy E6. So if you're gonna go to an E6 to be a good E6, then yes, but, like, understand that's a significantly more work, and that's significantly more responsibility. And so when people are just like, like, "I need the money," or whatever, I'm like, so, like, go ace your job. Like, you will get rewarded for this. You will get a better rating, which will equate to more refreshers, which will equate to bigger bonus. Um, but, yeah, don't do it just for the numbers. Do it because, like, whatever the responsibility is at the next level is what you actually want to do. And for me, it was, like, for me, you know, I quit my job in tech. I'm currently unemployed, sorry, self-employed. And what I'm doing now with my time full time is I'm guiding ML engineers through their careers. Like, I do a lot of one-on-one still, and I'm trying to scale that through the YouTube channel, the podcast, whatever.
Uh-huh.
But that's the kind of work I would do if, like, nobody was paying me, as evidenced by the fact that I'm currently doing it with very few people paying me for it. So to me, like, I had to get there. That was the conversation we had in 2020. I was like, "No,
Yep.
this is you don't understand. This is what I want to do, right?" If that's not what you wanna do, I met a guy at NeurIPS, really smart guy, has been in the industry since the '90s, knows the insides and outsides, works on Gemma, at Google, and he's an E5, and I'm like, "Do you wanna move up?" He's like, "Why?" It's like, "I got everything I want." Like, what else? Like, what am I gonna get as an E6 or L6 at Google that I don't get as an L5? And I'm like, "You're absolutely like, that is a very smart way to look at your career because up to E5, you do have to move up. So E5 is a senior engineer at these companies. And so, like, senior engineer is somebody who can work independently. And you can give them a project and say, here's the first couple of things, but you go figure out the rest. And we're trying to work with colleagues that are like that because otherwise we're going to get burnt out and die.
Yeah.
So up to E5, it is at Meta and Google and all the companies, it is really up or out, right? Like, if you can't get promoted from an E4 to an E5 in a certain amount of time, you're probably not going to stay in that company for very long. I think you get like 5 halves or something like that. So 2.5 years, you gotta figure out how to be an E5. But E5 to an E6 is completely optional. E6 to an E7 is completely optional. Uh, we had two E8s in the Meta ads org, which is a huge org that generates all the money. We did not have an E9. And and by the way, the way that you interview for an E9 is Mark Zuckerberg picks up the phone and calls you and says,
What?
"Hey, will you come work for us?" And if you
Yeah.
say yes, you've cleared the interview. So that's how you interview for an E9. So, like, just understand that, like, it gets exponentially harder with every level. E5 is the expectation. Everything beyond that is like, what do you want to do with your career?
What can you expect from E6 to E7? Because you mentioned how you're mentoring all of these folks, or you're leading bigger projects, and you're helping unstick projects, and that's like your sweet spot. I didn't understand if that was your specific archetype or
Mhm.
if that's everyone is expected to
Yeah,
do
that's my
that.
specific archetype.
Okay.
There was another E7 at Meta that I worked with quite closely who basically just owned all of the revenue. And so whenever there was any issue, any like outage or whatever, RJ would come in and fix it, or like coordinate a team to fix it in real time. And so like that's the amount of responsibility, right? Right, like all of revenue, like no biggie, just a couple of $1 billion between friends, and we had E7s who like were really deep on what we call signal loss, which is like there's a lot of regulation. There are a lot of like things coming out of Apple, for example, right, where they're like, okay, like you can't use our data for ads anymore or whatever. And so when something like that happens, it's probably an E8 that starts that. That's like, okay, this is going to impact the entire company. Let's understand what this is going to be and kind of start setting up initiatives for the next 5 years. And then
Uh,
E8s delegate to E7s like, okay, this is a particular stream of work we need to get done. You go find the teams that you need for this and you go like coordinate them however you want. But it's basically less and less defined the higher up you go, what you do, where like an E9 just kind of walks around and says, oh, you know what? I bet I can get us 1% more revenue tomorrow if I do that. And I talked to the guy that I really want to have on my podcast, that hopefully will come.
yeah.
But I talked to him about the difference between like an E6 and an E9. And I was like, as an E6, like I got my teams to increase meta revenue by 1%. In fact, that was Q2 of like 23, and or Q1 of 23, where our work basically showed up on the earnings report. We exceeded by 1%, and like my team has increased the revenue by 1%. And so I was like, huh, that's interesting. That's us. But and his response was like, an E9 does that by themselves. So like you do
Wow.
that with a team of people, and E9 does that by themselves. And I was like, oh, okay. But that is different. So,
Wow. Yeah, this is all fascinating to me, especially because I lived and played in startup life
yeah.
for my whole career. And the large enterprise is so foreign, especially these tech forward enterprises that are very sought after jobs. And there's a lot of people that want to be in these jobs because of I think mainly because of the earning potential.
Yeah, the money is incredible.
Yeah, I don't
I'm
think
never
anybody
gonna make
wakes
as
up.
much money as I made as an E6 at Meta.
Nobody's like, "My life calling is to optimize the privacy ad spends," or whatever the hell you were doing when you were
Well, and
there.
you see that, right? Like, I lasted, a little bit over a year, an average tenure is like 2 years.
Ugh,
At Meta, it's a little bit higher, but, at Meta Ads, it's a little bit lower, so,
yeah,
but, like, it's a lot of churn and burn. There's a lot of like, don't get me wrong, like, I'm glad that I had that experience, and I think it was, a good step in my career, and I'm glad that I did it. But it's there are some people who stay there for a long time, but that's not the majority opinion. And a lot of us just, like, churn through one of those and then go to another big tech company and then come back and then, but yeah, it's really hard to be in place. But I imagine in startups, it's pretty hard too. Like, I've worked at startups a little bit, and it's like a different company, right? Like, when it grows, if it fails, then you have a problem of like, I don't want to work for a continuously failing company. And if it succeeds, then it becomes a very different company. It goes from like 20 people to 600 people, and
yep,
suddenly everything is different.
yeah,
You have HR.
yeah, and yeah, you have to navigate politics, and you have to navigate the company, whereas before you could just say, "I wanna do this," like you were saying with the E9, and you pretty much have carte blanche to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of distinguished engineers actually do come from like early startup engineers. Like the founding engineer or the CTO of a startup. Lots of them often make those like distinguished positions. At Adobe, about the only way that I know to be distinguished was to be acquired, and like you were the CTO of the company that was acquired. But they're vanishingly few of them. I think at Adobe we had 20 when I was there.
Yeah, that makes
You
sense.
know, like it's under 100 at those levels. But you know, I don't know if Guido is even, well, he probably is distinguished, but you know, if you write Python, like I'll let you slide. I think that's worth it. But it's like the guy at Amazon is like the guy who developed Java or something. Like you really have to do huge things in order to get to those positions. Like you don't apply for them. There's no job opening on Meta website that says, you know, come be a distinguished engineer. And also you don't need a resume. Like by then you have to give talks.
Yeah.
By then there's only one way forward. Is that
No,
people know.
you're getting courted to give
Yeah.
talks. It's one of those type deals.
Also, if you are an E8 or E9 and want to come work at Meta, you basically just have to call them up. Like it's not, you don't have to wait for a position to be open. They will always hire E8s, E9s, anybody who can perform at that level. But
Well, sweet man, we're gonna put all your details on your YouTube channel and all the stuff that you're doing into the description so that anyone
great.
who is trying to go on this journey, they can follow along with you and learn a ton from you. The other thing that I want to mention is that you have been super kind in helping us put together this asset of what it takes to go from senior to staff. And so we're doing that in the community as something that, like you said, there's not a lot of information out there. So I'm glad that we can work together on that and hopefully have something see the light of day. It's still early days, so you never know if it's actually going to happen, but
Oh, it'll
I've got
happen. We'll
confidence.
make it happen.
We'll make it happen. That's what I love. And I also look forward to when you have the podcast with the ex-director that you worked with, maybe we'll just play it on this stream too, so that the folks who are looking for part two and you dangled the carrot, we will have it for them too. Uh,
Excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely keep people informed. And I am in the MLOps community Slack too. So if anybody
yes.
needs to reach to me directly, you can. I sometimes take a couple of days to reply. Sorry about that. But
That's what happens when you're unworked. What did you call it? What was the frame? The change of frame?
self-employed, I guess,
Self-employed. That's
is
what
what
it
I'm
is.
supposed to say, right?
I love that perspective
Yeah,
shift. That
yeah,
is a great one.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was a very intentional move. It's not like when I was at NeurIPS, like there were a bunch of companies who were like, "Oh yeah, with your experience, we really want you." But I'm like, I want to spend some time, maybe half a year, maybe a year, really focused on trying to help people, and maybe that's what I do for the rest of time. Maybe not. Maybe I do come back, but I do want to see how I can scale the things that I know work, right? Like I've worked with people one on one for a long time. I've worked with my teams for a long time, and it was really I was helping a principal engineer go through the interview process, and he was the first person who like scheduled some insane number of sessions with me. Usually people do like 3 or 4 and then they basically like move on. And he was like, no, 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 I need to pick your brain for a lot of things. And then when we were done, he was like, wait, why don't you scale this? And I'm like, I don't know how. He's like, well, go start like a channel or something. And I was like,
Yeah.
okay. Uh,
Boom.
that's the other thing you learn as staff. When a principal tells you to do something, you just like, you don't second guess them too much. You understand how much smarter they are than you. You
Yeah.
just go do it. Uh, so, uh,
Take their
so,
word.
so, so that's where that came from. Is like people have asked me to scale this, and I'm trying to, and it's still early days. You'll see if you go check out my YouTube channel that there are some bells that are a little bit loud, and I don't know the last bit of audio editing. Demetrius is helping me, so I'll get there. But yeah, definitely excited to uh, be helping so many people, and like my biggest video right now has like 14,000 views. And a lot of them are from like unique viewers. So let's say 10,000. I don't remember the exact number. I'm like, when have I ever talked to 10,000 people? Like,
Yeah, you're making an impact.
yeah, 10,000 people is a concert. It's a small concert. I'm not Taylor Swift yet, but it's a small
Soon.
concert, but
Yeah.
it's a concert, and so it really is a great opportunity in our time to be able to help so many people in such an efficient manner. So